I heard the sound before I saw the disaster. The unmistakable snap-snap of hedge clippers, followed by a woman's voice humming the tune of "We Are the Champions," like she was in the final round of a yard work competition she wasn't invited to. I dropped my coffee and sprinted to the side of my property, still in pajama pants, only to find her, Karen from the HOA board, standing on a plastic stool in yoga leggings, aggressively snipping a perfectly square hole right through my 7-foot-tall privacy hedge. When I yelled, "What the hell are you doing?" she didn't even flinch. She smiled, tossed a handful of trimmed leaves over her shoulder, and said, "Just making it easier for everyone, sweetheart." "You're welcome." That was the moment I realized my piece was over, and that I was about to become the HOA's worst nightmare. My name's Marcus, and I had moved into the house 3 months earlier. It was my dream home, a place just on the edge of an HOA-controlled community in a quiet suburb. One of the reasons I bought it was because it technically wasn't part of the HOA jurisdiction, by 4 glorious feet, according to the property survey, but it still had the clean sidewalks, the trimmed lawns, and that peaceful neighborhood aesthetic I craved. I worked remotely as a software engineer and valued my privacy more than most people value air conditioning in a heatwave. The hedge surrounding my property was mature, thick, and provided complete solitude from the rest of the world. That hedge was my boundary, my green wall, and my fortress, and Karen had just violated it. After I caught her in the act, I told her flat out to get off my property. She responded like she was royalty and I was a peasant. "I'm the HOA landscaping coordinator," she said, as if that gave her the right to act like Edward Scissorhands on my private land. She claimed she was cutting the hole for community efficiency, that people walking to the HOA clubhouse should have an easier shortcut through my side yard. I pointed out that this was not public land. Her only reply was, "It will save people nearly 45 seconds per trip." That night, I attempted to patch the hedge with some fast-growing branches from the nursery. I also installed a motion sensor camera aimed directly at the opening, just in case Karen decided to return. My gut said this wasn't over. And I was right. At 2:47 a.m., the camera triggered. The next morning, I opened the footage and nearly spit my cereal across the kitchen. There she was, in a bathrobe and slippers, dragging a 6-foot aluminum ladder over to the hedge and neatly clipping away my repairs like she was prepping for a topiary contest. She even posed for the camera and mouthed, "Nice try." I reported the incident to the police. The officer was polite but non-committal. "Technically it's trespassing," he said, "but without a confrontation or property damage that goes beyond trimming plants, the DA probably won't prosecute." I asked what counted as property damage. He shrugged and said, "She'd have to cut down a tree or something substantial." So apparently, cutting a person-sized hole through a privacy hedge was just suburban mischief. Karen's next move was to walk directly into my yard during daylight hours, carrying a measuring wheel and a clipboard. When I demanded to know what she was doing, she claimed she was mapping the optimized path, and again insisted she had verbal permission from the HOA president to modify my property for community use. I asked her to provide this president's written approval. She told me to mind my tone, and marched off muttering something about how new neighbors never understand the vision. I emailed the HOA directly, attaching photos, video footage, and legal language about property lines and trespassing. The response I got was a 1-sentence email: "We're aware of the situation and reviewing it with our legal counsel." Translation: they weren't going to do a damn thing. The following weekend, I decided to take drastic measures. I planted fast-growing hedging plants, reinforced the hole with wooden panels, and posted a private property, "Do not enter" sign. I even spoke with a zoning officer from the city to confirm that my property was indeed outside HOA jurisdiction. He gave me the good news with a smile: "You're in the clear. They can't regulate anything on your side of the line." Just as I was beginning to feel secure, a package was dropped on my doorstep by a courier. Inside was a formal notice from the HOA, accusing me of creating a visual obstruction and threatening to fine me for violations of neighborhood harmony. It was total nonsense. The document even included photos of my hedge, photos clearly taken from within my property line. Someone had trespassed again just to build a case. I called their bluff. I replied with a scanned copy of my property survey, highlighted the boundary in red, and added a note that said, "You are in violation of city code if you attempt further action on my land. Kindly redirect future nonsense to my attorney." The next day, someone egged my mailbox. Subtle. That same night, I overheard Karen talking loudly on her phone in her backyard, which faced mine. "I swear, if that man doesn't tear down that green monstrosity, I'll do it myself. We've had enough of his attitude." I made sure the backyard mic picked up every word. Now I had audio. I backed it up to the cloud and shared it with my lawyer friend, who laughed and said, "Want help drafting a cease and desist?" But I didn't want to play defense anymore. I wanted to end this. Permanently. The next morning, I sat down with my coffee, looked out at the ragged opening in the hedge, and had a vision. Not a patch. Not a wall of new shrubs. Not even barbed wire. I pictured iron, gleaming black and 10 feet tall. Elegant yet indestructible. A fortress gate for the modern era. Something Karen couldn't climb, couldn't cut, and couldn't even complain about without tasting her own medicine. I drove straight to an ironworks shop on the industrial side of town and asked to see their portfolio. The owner, a guy named Lucas who looked like a blacksmith from a fantasy novel, grinned when I described what I wanted. "You want something HOA-proof?" he asked. I said, "No. I want something Karen-proof." He nodded like he'd heard the same request before. Back home, I drafted a design on my tablet, a decorative but daunting wrought iron fence with pointed caps, weatherproof finish, and enough architectural flair to make it legally ornamental. I submitted it to the city for approval. They signed off with barely a second glance. Apparently, there's no law against having tastefully aggressive boundaries. And so began my personal Cold War. Karen had declared war with hedge clippers. I was about to respond with an iron curtain. As the first truckload of steel arrived at my driveway and the sun gleamed off the polished bars, I realized something incredible. She had thought she was trimming a bush. But what she'd really done was plant the seed for the most glorious, HOA-destroying revenge this neighborhood had ever seen. The morning the first section of the fence went up, I brewed my coffee with extra satisfaction. As the welding team unpacked the ornate iron panels and lined them up beside my property, I felt something shift, not just in the soil beneath my yard but in the air, in the balance of power that Karen had wielded so confidently for years. The sound of clanking metal echoed across the street like a declaration of independence. Within minutes, Karen came storming out of her house in her usual getup. Oversized sunglasses, a pink bathrobe, and a clipboard she probably hadn't used for anything other than intimidation. Her face twisted the second she saw the iron panels gleaming in the morning sun. It was the expression of someone realizing the game had changed, and she didn't know the new rules. She marched up to the workers, barking, "You need to stop this construction right now." When they ignored her completely, focused on aligning the posts, she turned to me. Her voice was shrill enough to make birds take off from nearby trees. "I told you this hedge nonsense was over. Now you're putting up prison bars?" I took a slow sip of my coffee and walked toward her, pausing just enough to let the silence feel like thunder. I handed her a folder with laminated city permits, design approvals, and a certified survey. She flipped through the pages like they were written in another language. I said, "This is decorative security fencing approved by the city and fully within my property line. Unlike your clippers, this is legal." Her lips quivered, probably from the realization that her tantrums were officially powerless here. Over the next 2 days, the fence installation became a neighborhood event. Cars slowed down to watch the progress. A few neighbors nodded in approval. One even offered me a bottle of wine with a grin and whispered, "We've all wanted to do this for years." Karen, meanwhile, paced like a restless hawk. She took photos of every inch of the construction. She shouted at the workers during their lunch break. She called the HOA president twice a day demanding an emergency board meeting. None of it mattered. The fence kept rising, one beautiful iron bar at a time. On the third day, I came home from the hardware store to find a bright yellow notice taped to my door. It was from the HOA, accusing me of violating community aesthetic guidelines. The letter demanded I halt construction and appear before the HOA board for a compliance hearing. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my tool bag. My property, as I had confirmed with multiple sources, was just outside the HOA's control. Their boundaries stopped 4 feet before my backyard began. This was the geographical equivalent of them trying to arrest someone in another country. I crafted a response that evening. I printed out the property survey again, circled the relevant zoning boundaries in red, and attached a copy of the municipal permit. My note was short, factual, and included the phone number of the city's zoning inspector for any further questions. I dropped it off at the HOA office with a smile. The clerk looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. Later that night, I heard Karen ranting loudly in her backyard, pacing like she was preparing for a courtroom drama that would never come. I caught phrases like eyesore and metal monstrosity and traitor neighbors. My security cameras captured her throwing pebbles at the fence and muttering curses under her breath. Then came Karen's most ridiculous move yet. One afternoon, while the crew was taking a break and I was working on my laptop, I heard a crash followed by a shriek. I ran outside to see Karen clinging to the top of the partially completed fence, one leg over and one slipper dangling below. She had apparently tried to climb it to prove it was dangerous. When she realized the spikes weren't just decorative, she panicked and froze halfway over. Her phone slipped out of her robe pocket and clattered onto my lawn. I had no choice but to call the fire department. 2 firefighters showed up, and while they were professional, I could tell they were fighting hard not to laugh. One of them gently helped her down with a ladder, while the other retrieved her slipper like he was rescuing a kitten. After they left, Karen stormed away, wrapped in a blanket one of the firefighters had given her. She didn't say a word to me, but the look she gave me said everything. Later that night, someone uploaded the entire incident online. Turns out one of my neighbors had been recording from his second-floor balcony. The video, titled Iron Karen's Great Escape, spread quickly across local Facebook group. By morning, it had over 20,000 views. Karen's reputation, already frayed, was now publicly shredded. The next day, I received another letter from the HOA. This one was more desperate than threatening. It claimed I was disrupting community harmony and asked me to consider a less aggressive solution. I took a red pen and wrote one sentence across the top before mailing it back. Community harmony doesn't require me to accept trespassing. That was the end of their letters. But Karen wasn't done. That weekend, she called an emergency HOA meeting in her backyard, complete with folding chairs, lemonade, and an old portable speaker. A handful of other board members showed up, looking visibly uncomfortable. I watched from my upstairs window with popcorn. I couldn't hear every word, but based on her arm-waving and dramatic voice, it was clear she was trying to rally them against me. At one point, she pointed to my fence and screamed something that made 3 members get up and leave early. I think it was when she said, "He's building a fortress because he's hiding something illegal in there." By the time the fence was fully installed, complete with vine-ready lattices, solar-powered lights, and a self-closing iron gate, it had become a neighborhood landmark. Strangers came by to take photos. Some thought it was a new art installation. One woman asked if I could recommend the designer for her own home. The irony was delicious. Karen had cut a hole in my hedge to make her life easier, and instead of saving 45 seconds, she had now created a monument to her own failure that she had to walk past every day. A monument she could not climb, clip, or complain out of existence. That week, I got a surprise call from Lucas, the fence contractor. He told me a local home improvement magazine was interested in doing a feature on unique neighborhood renovations. He'd given them my number, with my permission. The editor asked if they could include a backstory on why the fence was built. I said, "Oh, there's a story all right, but you might need a few extra pages." And just like that, the balance had shifted. No longer was I the quiet neighbor keeping to himself, dodging HOA threats and Karen's clippers. I was now the guy who stood his ground, built a wall, and turned an act of pettiness into a community-wide spectacle. Karen had underestimated one simple truth. When you invade a peaceful man's privacy, you don't get silence. You get iron. I began noticing something strange a few days after the fence was complete. Despite Karen's public humiliation and the fact that she had now been nicknamed Iron Karen in every neighborhood WhatsApp group, people still occasionally walked through the gate. It was subtle, just the latch clicking and someone slipping through as if they belonged. At first, I thought it might have been one of the construction crew or a curious neighbor trying to sneak a photo. But then I checked the security footage. One by one, I watched members of the HOA board, including Karen herself, casually letting themselves into my yard through the side entrance and crossing straight through to the clubhouse. Even after the cameras, the warnings, the very public disaster she had endured, Karen was still treating my property like a public park. It made no sense. They had their sidewalks. They had their official HOA paths. Why keep trespassing? I decided to get to the bottom of it. I changed the gate lock to a digital keypad and monitored the footage again. The next morning, Karen walked up to the gate, typed something into the keypad like she had every right to be there, then froze. When it didn't open, she leaned in and tapped the numbers again, slower this time. After a long pause, she tried shaking the gate. When that didn't work, she whipped out her phone and started texting furiously. Later that day, I received an email from the HOA titled Urgent, Gate Access. The message demanded I provide the passcode for community continuity, and stated that my gate was impeding the traditional walking route used by several board members. I nearly laughed out loud. Traditional route? That wasn't tradition, that was uninvited trespassing disguised as entitlement. I responded politely but directly. My gate is on private property, and no one other than invited guests will be given access. Thank you. But something wasn't sitting right. Why were they so obsessed with getting through my property to the clubhouse? I reviewed the old footage again, this time paying closer attention to the times of day and the people who passed through. That's when I noticed something odd. Most of the trespassing happened between 6:30 and 8 p.m., several nights a week. Always the same few people. Karen, 2 other board members, sometimes the HOA president, and all of them carried tote bags or yoga mat. Curiosity got the better of me. That Friday, I took a walk past the clubhouse around 6:45 p.m., acting like I was just out for fresh air. Through the windows, I saw it. Strings of fairy lights, candles, a sign that read Namaste and Rose in glitter letters. Inside were about a dozen people doing yoga poses on mats, with music playing and wine glasses balanced next to their hand. Karen stood at the front like a proud instructor, not wearing her usual anger but smiling like she'd found her calling. This wasn't just a neighborhood gathering. It was a business. I returned home and dug deeper. A quick search on social media led me to a private Instagram page called the HOA Flow, a yoga and wine wellness community hosted by none other than Karen herself. There were dozens of posts, some even tagged with location coordinates that matched the clubhouse. Comments from neighbors praised the exclusive experience and asked when the next one would be. One comment mentioned bringing a guest for a $10 drop-in fee. That's when it hit me. Karen was using HOA property for a personal business, and she needed my yard as a shortcut to sneak guests in without alerting the rest of the community. It was perfect. I had them. That night, I called a friend of mine who worked for the city's zoning office. I asked a few casual questions about commercial use of community spaces and fire code violations. He got interested quickly, especially when I mentioned the fairy lights and open bottles of alcohol. He told me that if what I was describing was accurate, they were violating several zoning codes, including unauthorized gatherings and failure to have proper occupancy signage. The following Monday, I submitted an anonymous tip through the city's code enforcement portal, attaching screenshots from the Instagram page and listing the recurring times and locations. I didn't hear anything back for 2 days. Then Wednesday evening arrived, and just like clockwork, Karen's group assembled. But this time, instead of a relaxing, downward dog, the party was interrupted by 2 uniformed inspectors knocking on the door with clipboards in hand. From my upstairs window, I watched chaos unfold. Karen tried to stall them at the entrance, blocking their view, but the inspectors pushed past. Within 5 minutes, the fairy lights were shut off, the wine bottles were capped, and the guests were being ushered out with confused looks. Karen's perfect little yoga empire was collapsing in real time. One of the inspectors taped a cease and desist notice on the door as they walked out. The next morning, an emergency HOA newsletter went out declaring that, due to unforeseen zoning complications, the clubhouse would be closed for routine inspection. What they didn't mention was the fine the HOA had received or the personal citation issued to Karen for operating a business without a license. I thought that would be the end of it. I had assumed Karen would finally give up and retreat. But I had underestimated her capacity for escalation. A few nights later, I was awoken by an alert on my phone. My motion sensor had been triggered at the front gate. I checked the footage and saw Karen again, crouched down with a spray can in hand. She painted the words "fascist" in bright red across my iron fence, her hand shaking with fury. I watched her stumble away, clearly trying to avoid being seen, but it was too late. The camera caught her face in full HD. I forwarded the footage to the local police department, filed a vandalism report, and emailed the HOA for good measure. Karen was fined for vandalism and given a formal warning by the police. She was also placed on the community's internal watch list for repeat property violations, a humiliating title that several residents found quite entertaining. But Karen wasn't done embarrassing herself. In a last-ditch effort to regain control of the narrative, she began spreading rumors about me. She claimed I was an ex-felon, said I had illegal surveillance tech hidden in my trees. At one point, she even floated the idea that I was a government agent monitoring the neighborhood for secret crimes. The rumor mill churned, but unlike Karen's twisted tales, I had one powerful weapon on my side: the truth. And the truth was gaining traction fast. One afternoon, my cousin Jonah came to visit. He just so happened to be a well-known television judge, famous for his no-nonsense courtroom persona. When he saw the fence and heard the story, he laughed, snapped a selfie in front of it, and posted it with the caption, "Respect the iron, respect the boundary." Within hours it went viral. Neighborhood gossip turned into neighborhood pride. People stopped by to see the now-famous fence, and several even dropped off thank-you notes for standing your ground. Karen, once the self-appointed queen of the block, was now a punchline. Her shortcut dream had turned into a very public downfall. And still, I wasn't done. Because Karen wasn't just fighting against me anymore. She had poked the bear, broken the law, and made a mockery of herself. And soon, I was going to make sure that her influence over the HOA vanished for good. Because fences might keep people out, but cameras. It was around this time that the mood in the neighborhood began to shift. Karen's reputation had become something between a running joke and a cautionary tale. The woman who once held HOA meetings like royal decrees was now whispered about like a local legend gone wrong. I could feel it every time I stepped out, neighbors giving me respectful nods, some even going out of their way to cross Karen off the invite list to block parties and small gatherings. Her grasp on the HOA was slipping, but she wasn't going down quietly. No, Karen had one last desperate trick up her sleeve, and she was about to make her boldest play yet. It began with an envelope slid under my door early one Saturday morning. No postage, no name, just a typed letter printed on HOA letterhead. It read like something written by someone trying too hard to sound official, full of words like immediate compliance and emergency action. The letter claimed that the HOA had voted to revise its bylaws regarding fence height and that my newly constructed iron wall now violated community structural harmony rules. It gave me 30 days to remove the fence or face escalating daily fines. It was signed by the HOA secretary, but the name was misspelled, and I knew from casual chats that she had actually moved to Florida a month earlier. Still, I decided to play it smart. I scanned the letter, called the city's zoning department again, and asked a few pointed questions about HOA power. As I suspected, since my property was outside the HOA's jurisdiction, their rule changes, real or imagined, meant nothing. It was a bluff, an empty threat dressed in fancy words and fake authority. I could have ignored it completely, but something in me wanted more than just to win. I wanted Karen to lose so publicly that there would be no coming back. So I showed up to the emergency HOA meeting scheduled for the following Tuesday, letter in hand. The meeting was held at the community clubhouse, freshly scrubbed of any trace of Karen's yoga wine cult. There were about 20 people in attendance, many of them likely coerced by Karen's dramatic emails about reclaiming the neighborhood's integrity. When I walked in, the room quieted. Karen sat at the front of the room beside the acting HOA president, her face carefully composed but eyes shooting daggers. I didn't take a seat. I stood at the back and waited as the meeting began. Karen launched into a long speech about community standards, about how rogue behavior was undermining the spirit of the neighborhood, and how certain individuals had weaponized their independence to disrupt unity. Her voice was passionate, but her logic was strained, like someone trying to build a house of cards during a windstorm. When she finally motioned for the vote to enforce the new fence height bylaw, I raised my hand. I said I have some concerns about the legality of this motion, especially since it affects properties not under HOA governance. A few heads turned. I walked to the front and handed out printed copies of the zoning map, permits, and an official statement from the city planner confirming that my property was outside the HOA's reach. I also attached a notarized letter from the former HOA secretary stating she never signed or approved the letter sent to me. Karen's face began to twitch, her lips thinning into a tight line. The acting HOA president took a long pause, read the documents, and then cleared his throat. It appears this entire issue is beyond our jurisdiction. I don't see how we can proceed with enforcement, and frankly, this meeting should have never included this item on the agenda. Several attendees nodded in agreement. One elderly woman leaned over and whispered loudly, "Maybe we should vote on replacing the board instead." That got a few chuckles, and Karen, seeing the tide turning fast, stood up and slammed her folder shut. She wasn't done yet. Karen launched into a tirade about how the board was weak, how they were letting dangerous precedents take root, and how my fence represented an attack on everything the HOA stood for. Her voice cracked as she went on, her words spiraling into accusations about personal vendettas, property values, and a supposed rumor that I was a government agent installing surveillance equipment inside the metal post. The room went silent. Then someone in the back laughed. Then another. Within seconds, half the room was stifling giggles. Karen had crossed the line from obsessed to unhinged, and there was no walking back. Security was called to escort her out, not because she was a threat, but because she refused to stop shouting. As she was led out, she pointed at me and screamed, "He's destroying everything. He's making a mockery of all we've built." But no one stood to support her. Her words echoed in an empty room of nodding heads and relieved faces. She wasn't feared anymore. She was pitted. The next morning, the acting HOA president showed up at my doorstep. He apologized formally for the board's failure to control the situation sooner. He told me Karen had been suspended from all board activities pending a formal review and that they were rewriting policies to prevent any future abuses of power. I thanked him, and before he left, he said something that stuck with me. he said. "You didn't just build a fence, Marcus. You built a line none of us realized we needed." Emboldened by the shift, I decided to do something that would both celebrate the end of Karen's reign and remind the neighborhood of the importance of standing up for yourself. I added decorative lights to the fence, trained flowering vines to climb the iron bars, and installed a wooden archway over the gate with the words "private property" etched into the beam. It wasn't meant to be aggressive. It was a statement of peace enforced by clear boundaries. And then came the invitations. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to before began stopping by, complimenting the design, asking about the contractor, even dropping off small housewarming gifts. One family brought cookies. Another offered to help repaint my garage door. People began telling me their own stories, how Karen had fined them for leaving a trash bin out, for planting the wrong flowers, for parking 2 inches over a sidewalk. One man even said Karen had reported him to animal control because his cat looked too fat to be outdoors. Everyone had their version of the same tale, and now that she was gone, it felt like a communal breath had been released. With Karen's influence shattered, the HOA shifted dramatically. The new leadership introduced transparency policies, held votes for real community improvements, and even passed a motion to turn a vacant lot into a public garden. It was as if Karen had been keeping the entire neighborhood in a chokehold of passive-aggressive dictatorship, and my fence had been the crowbar that broke it open. By the end of the month, the clubhouse hosted its first real block party in years. No yoga, no lectures, no power plays. Just food, music, laughter, and the collective relief of people finally free from tyranny disguised as neighborhood governance. Someone even joked that I should run for HOA president. I politely declined. And Karen? She still lived there, tucked away in her house like a ghost of a fallen empire. I saw her once through her blinds, peeking out as the block party kicked off. Her face was pale, tight with bitterness, her hands clutching the curtain. But she didn't come out. She didn't shout. She didn't throw eggs or spray paint anything. For the first time since the Hedge incident, Karen was quiet. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I received an unexpected knock at the door. When I opened it, there stood a young man in a navy suit holding a clipboard and a nervous smile. He introduced himself as an assistant from the county clerk's office. Apparently, someone had submitted a formal petition attempting to override the city's zoning exception on my fence. The petition claimed the fence posed a public safety hazard, violated emergency access regulations, and threatened visual continuity of the community. The name at the top of the signature list? Karen. Of course. I took the packet and thanked him politely, already guessing what I would find when I flipped through the pages. I didn't even have to dig far. By the 3rd page, I noticed something immediately suspicious, signature after signature in nearly identical handwriting. Some were from people I knew had moved away. One was from a neighbor who had passed away the year before. It wasn't just bold. It was illegal. I sat down at my kitchen table, pulled up the footage from the security camera I had installed near the mailbox, and sure enough, 2 nights earlier, there was Karen. She stood hunched over the petition forms, filling in names with a flashlight and a cup of wine in one hand. It wasn't just bad behavior anymore. It was forgery. I compiled the footage, scanned every page of the falsified petition, and forwarded everything to the city attorney's office. Within 48 hours, Karen received a formal letter notifying her that she was under investigation for falsifying municipal documents and obstruction of zoning protocol. The penalties were serious: potential fines, possible misdemeanor charges, and most importantly, an official record of her nonsense finally catching up with her. The HOA board, now entirely restructured and free from Karen's grip, issued a formal apology to me. They made it very clear that the petition was not their doing and that Karen had acted entirely on her own. They voted unanimously to strip her of all community privileges, including her access to HOA resources, clubhouses, and event planning. She was banned from participating in or hosting any gatherings in the neighborhood facilities. The document outlining these sanctions was printed, signed, and delivered to every home in the neighborhood. I didn't post it on my front door, but I'll admit I left a copy taped to the inside of my living room window for a few days, just in case she wanted to look in. Around this time, I decided to take it one step further. I hired a landscaping crew to transform the iron fence into something even more beautiful and permanent. They installed a set of flowering arches, ran a new stone walkway along the interior edge, and added soft lighting woven between the posts. I called it my victory garden. And because I had the time and the means, I threw a party. An actual, proper, invitation-only backyard party. No politics, no agendas, just neighbors, friends, and a chance to enjoy peace with the people who stood by me. I called it the Fence Fest. Flyers went out digitally. RSVP was required. And within hours, nearly the entire street had signed up. The fence, once the subject of Karen's rage and rebellion, had become a symbol of quiet strength. I even brought in a local food truck and hired a jazz trio to play under the twinkle lights. People laughed, took photos with the fence, and shared their own stories about run-ins with Karen that had never gone public. One woman joked that my gate should have its own Instagram page. Another brought a custom cake shaped like a wrought iron panel, complete with icing spike. By nightfall, the party was in full swing. There were kids playing lawn games, adults sipping wine, and the unmistakable hum of a community finally breathing easy. And right across the street, in the dark window of her home, stood Karen. I didn't need a camera to know she was watching. She always did. But this time, there was no outburst, no threats, no clipboard, no late-night vandalism. She was powerless, and she knew it. A few days later, I received a letter from the city stating that the charges against Karen were officially being pursued. The forged petition had violated multiple civic ordinances, and she was being summoned for a hearing at the municipal court. When word of that reached the neighborhood, the collective reaction was one of relief, not cruelty. People were tired. Tired of drama, tired of fear, tired of being bullied into silence. This wasn't revenge. It was accountability, long overdue and sorely needed. The day of the hearing, Karen arrived at the courthouse alone. No family, no friends, not even a single HOA supporter left to accompany her. She tried to argue that she had misunderstood the petition process, that the signatures were symbolic, and that the entire situation was a smear campaign orchestrated by a disgruntled neighbor. But the judge wasn't buying it. He read aloud the zoning codes, the city's policy on petition fraud, and reminded her that claiming ignorance didn't exempt someone from consequences. She was fined, issued a misdemeanor citation, and placed under city monitoring for community disruption. As she exited the courthouse, reporters from a local news outlet snapped photos of her looking utterly defeated. The news clip made it to the local station later that evening. It showed footage of Karen's earlier antics, the fence climbing, the trespassing, even a short segment about the fake yoga classes, all strung together like a mini documentary on how to get banned from your own neighborhood. I didn't ask for that kind of exposure, but I won't lie and say I didn't chuckle when I saw it. There she was, the self-declared guardian of neighborhood order, reduced to a public warning sign for entitled behavior. In the weeks that followed, things settled into a peaceful rhythm. The HOA shifted focus to actual improvements, upgraded lighting on walkways, a new community garden, better communication with residents. Neighbors started attending meetings for the first time in years. Ideas flowed. Projects got approved. Kids played outside without their parents worrying about citations for riding scooters too loudly. It was the kind of neighborhood people dream of, cooperative, open, and finally free of the constant fear that Karen's shadow might darken their doorway. I spent more time outside. The garden around the fence blossomed beautifully. I added a bench near the entrance, a quiet place to sit with my morning coffee and reflect. It had become more than a boundary, it was a monument. Not to division, but to personal space, to the power of standing your ground without becoming the villain. Sometimes passers-by would stop, compliment the design, or just nod in quiet appreciation. One day, a young couple moving in from another city asked if I was the guy with the famous fence. I smiled and said yes. They replied, "Thank you. We read about it online. You made us feel better about moving here." And maybe that was the real win. Not the fines, not the party, not even Karen's downfall. The victory was in the message. That entitlement doesn't win when met with quiet resolve. That private property means something. That good neighbors respect boundaries. Not just fences but personal peace, space, and dignity. Karen had tried to cut a hole in my hedge, and in doing so, she cut open her own reputation, exposed her methods, and left herself wide open to the consequences she never thought she'd face.